Right, so between comments that have gone viral, aimed at the Tories yesterday, or the news of the abolition of NHS England in light of his well-known and significant donations from private health interests, our health secretary, the weaselly Wesley Streeting, might be strutting around like he's cock of the walk right now, whereas the truth is, he ended up opening his gaping chasm of a mouth and accidentally let the truth slip out amongst all the usual political nonsense. A barbed attack aimed at the Tories that roughly translated told them, why would people vote Tory again when Labour are proving they can be even bigger Tories than the original article? Look at me, I'm a great big fat red Tory. Worse, he did so in the context of people allegedly voting for change when the message clearly told all who were listening from him right there that they did no such thing at all. See for yourself in a moment. But this happened against that backdrop of NHS England being abolished, as was announced yesterday by Starmer, which has caused a great deal of confusion and concern. The confusion I can deal with. The concern may be valid, because although this is the undoing of what is ostensibly an unnecessary level of bureaucracy, the way it is being handled comes as small comfort to those who work in it. And when Labour are supposedly the party of workers, so they say, clues in the name, the optics of that have blown up in their faces well and truly as well. Is there any competence at all in this government?
So do we need this right now? Is it going to deliver? And also, this is really important. This puts it in the hands of Wes Streeting. Now, the Good Law Project did some work around where funding is coming from and where donations are coming from. And 60% of his donations since 2015 have come from either companies or individuals linked to private healthcare. What we're seeing right now in terms of waiting lists is a two-track system. So if you've got a simple thing to do, it's going to the private sector. We as taxpayers are paying the private sector. Okay, good, because the waiting lists are going down a bit quicker. If you've got something more complicated, it's staying in the NHS, which is more difficult.
But are you saying by mentioning the funding, that Wes Streeting has, I don't know if that's right or not, are you saying that he's basically being bought by private interests that's affecting his decision?
Listen, what I'm saying
is that not the implication of what you're saying?
Well, that is the implication of that work the Good Law Project has done. What I'm saying is that we have to be careful when we put this directly in the hands of politicians. We should look at where they get their donations from. Of course we should. We should look at why it is that our private sector contracts in the NHS are now being made for longer periods of time. And we should worry about this because in the short term, you might think, okay, their waiting list going down. In the longer term, as we've learned in Thames Water, as we've learned in different privatisation like trains, it ends up costing us more. So this is my general concern about this, is that we need to make sure we still have accountability.
Okay. Just very quickly. Faiza's basically saying Wes Streeting is effectively being bought off. I think that's kind of what you're implying there.
Well, I'm sorry, but you look into the numbers. You have to look behind every politician. Of course you do.
I'm sorry, but that is totally ludicrous. We've made more progress in 7 months in bringing down waiting times than the last government did in 14 years. Well, yes, okay, we've used spare capacity in the private sector. What's wrong with that if people are actually getting the treatment that they need? I'm very pragmatic about this. I absolutely believe profoundly in our NHS. But if we need to use spare capacity in the private sector, I'm very happy to do that. Waiting lists are coming down and are coming down for their 5th month running. And Wes Streeting and the Prime Minister and the whole government are absolutely determined to invest in our NHS, and that's why we put record levels of funding in. You talk about austerity. This is not austerity. £22.6 billion into the NHS is not austerity, but we need reform at the same time.
It must be so painful for the Conservative Party. It must be so painful watching a Labour government doing the things that they only ever talked about, reducing the size of bloated state bureaucracy, investing in defence, reforming our public services, bringing down the welfare bill. The public are asking, what is the point of the Conservative Party? I bet they're glad they chose change with Labour.
Yeah! Right, so that was 2 clips there. The first, a former Labour candidate for Chingford and Wood Green, before she got obnoxiously replaced, let's put it, by the Starmer machine for a more Starmer-friendly candidate from the other side of London, if I recall. No dissent allowed in Starmer's party, of course, the Starmer Labour Party. Faiza Shaheen, dropping truth bombs about Streeting and NHS privatisation, of which he has long been a cheerleader for. The Labour panellist on Question Time there, not denying it in the slightest, but she might wish she had been less honest about private provision. Because if Labour want to talk about abolishing Tory constructs in the NHS, like NHS England, keeping the privatisation is a lot more harmful to us and the NHS itself in the long term. But then there was that other short clip, wasn't there? Streeting enjoying himself immensely, enjoying himself far too much by telling the Tories in effect that Labour was now better at being the Tory Party than the Tory Party is. Doing the things they only dreamt about, he said, because Labour evidently are much worse, and yet still being vacant and stupid enough to imagine that comes across to the wider public as change. He was incidentally speaking in relation to those proposed upcoming cuts to disability benefits and other welfare cuts, so he should have been far less pleased with himself. Well, as you might well have imagined, in which case social media has had a little bit of a meltdown over this. Murray Foote wrote, "It is quite the thing to see a Labour Cabinet Secretary bragging to the Tories, 'We're more Tory than you.'" Damien from Brighton wrote, "What an utterly bizarre and grotesque spectacle. The Labour Health Minister, Wes Streeting, goading the Tories for not being as big a Tory as him." Wokarati Marty wrote, "Wes Streeting proving beautifully that the choice at the last election was red Tory or blue Tory. How much do elections cost the taxpayer? Because that one was a total waste of time." And Streeting's independent opponent at that last general election, Leanne Mohammed, wrote, "During my election campaign in my home of Ilford North, I criticised the Health Secretary for his unoriginal and tired approach. It's clear that when all else fails, he simply falls back on his Tory Tribute Act. Today's announcement of yet another top-down reorganisation of the NHS proves just how out of touch and devoid of real solutions they are. This is not leadership, it's a desperate ploy from a government that has run out of ideas. As I said, two sides of the same rusty coin." Well put. Those were amongst the more repeatable responses, as you might imagine. It is Streeting's links to private health that are of most concern, though, and Faiza Shaheen raised this on the BBC on Question Time, a story that has gone underreported, thrust into mainstream viewing, and as much as Fiona Bruce tried to bury it fast, play it down, and the Labour guest there, Emma Reynolds, defended the indefensible introduction of even more privatisation into the NHS, Labour not even hiding it, Streeting's donations from private health mean he really is the last man you want anywhere near the NHS when he is being lobbied and accepting donations from private health on the scale that he has. A report by the Good Law Project, as Shaheen made mention of there, has revealed that Streeting has accepted significant donations from private health interests, raising questions about his commitment to preserving the NHS as a public service. According to the report, Streeting has accepted donations from individuals and organisations with a vested interest in the privatisation of healthcare. These donations, which amount to more than £300,000, have come from figures such as John Armitage, who is a hedge fund manager with deep investments in private healthcare, and Trevor Chin, with links to private health as well as being a significant Zionist donor. And there are plenty of others too who have handed Wesley money, who stand to profit from the expansion of private provision within the NHS. While Streeting has defended these donations as legitimate political contributions, which they are, he has done nothing illegal, the optics are nonetheless damning. What are they giving him money for exactly? Because staff expenditure can go on the register of MPs' financial interests as many times as you like. These people did not amass such wealth that they can ply politicians with it by not expecting a return of some kind. A politician responsible for overseeing the NHS should not be financially indebted to those who seek to profit from its fragmentation. Therefore, the acceptance of these donations raise serious ethical questions. Streeting's role as Health Secretary places him in a position of ultimate influence over the future of the NHS. So by accepting money from private health interests, he now risks being perceived as beholden to their agenda. And that's a reasonable stretch to make, isn't it? He can deny that all he likes, and I don't doubt that he will, but the money speaks louder. This perception is exacerbated by his rhetoric, which adds on top of that, which often echoes the arguments of those who advocate for greater private sector involvement in healthcare. Streeting has repeatedly claimed that the private sector can step in to ease the workload of the NHS, which is a narrative that is not only misleading, but it's also dangerous. The idea that the private sector can alleviate all the pressures on the NHS is a complete fallacy. It's a myth. Proponents of privatisation argue that private providers can offer the additional capacity that's needed. They can reduce the waiting times. They can improve efficiency. However, this argument ignores the reality of how private healthcare operates in the UK. The private sector does not exist in a vacuum. It relies heavily on the same pool of healthcare professionals who work in the NHS. When private providers expand, they often poach staff from the NHS offering them greater incentives, exacerbating workforce shortages, and undermining the public health service the vast majority of us rely on. Remember that next time doctors and nurses have to go on strike for the pay awards they're getting, because the private sector will pay it quite happily to take those staff away from the NHS. Moreover, many NHS staff already work for both the NHS and private providers anyway. Dual employment, that means there is no spare capacity in the private sector at all then. Instead, it simply diverts resources away from the NHS. That means those waiting times get longer and longer. So the result, functionally, is a two-tier healthcare system in which those who can afford to pay for private care will receive faster treatment, whilst those who rely on the NHS face even longer waits, and that completely undermines the fundamental principle of the NHS, which is that healthcare should be provided on the basis of need, not ability to pay. And of course, the politicians will then point to these instances happening and say, well, this is why the NHS is failing. It's failing because it's being designed to. The expansion of private provision also prioritises profits over patients. Private healthcare companies are driven by the need to generate returns for their shareholders, same as anything that's been privatised. We know how it works, which often leads, therefore, to cost-cutting and a focus on lucrative procedures at the expense of less profitable, likely more difficult, but equally important services. Emergency medicine, for example. A profit-driven approach is incompatible with the ethos of the NHS, that the Labour Party, when it was still worthy of the name, created, which is to provide comprehensive care to all. But in addition to the concerns about privatisation, the government's decision to abolish NHS England has sparked widespread alarm, though a lot of that has been to do with widespread confusion. I'll give you an example that hits rather close to home. My 16-year-old son, Perrin, texted me from college yesterday saying, and I quote, "Keir Starmer is so stupid. Why has he shut down NHS England?" So I had to say to him, a kid who has had a few health issues and had a fair bit of NHS assistance, so he's learnt the value of the health service as much as any of us have in his short life so far, and was under the impression it had just gone. It's not so. Calm down, my boy. NHS England was established during the Tory-led Lansley reforms in 2013, supposedly was to make for a more efficient NHS, but really it was just an added layer of bureaucracy, with all the added expense that came with that. That when things went wrong in the health service, the government could, well, point to that and blame that for everything going wrong. So the decision to abolish that now by Labour has been justified as a way to streamline the healthcare system, reduce costs, and make ministers more directly accountable again, which theoretically it will, wouldn't it? They haven't got that entity, that body that they can point to and blame and accuse for failings. It'll fall on Streeting, won't it? But that only happens if we have an NHS left, of course, and with private provision being pursued as it is by Labour at the same time they're doing this, won't the private providers just be the new scapegoats in which case? But the abolition of NHS England will also result in the loss of thousands of jobs, creating chaos in the short to medium term. The restructuring could see the NHS England workforce cut by half, which will leave thousands out of work. And the claim that abolishing NHS England will make ministers more directly accountable is questionable for another reason as well. The combination of privatisation and the abolition of NHS England signals a move away from the principles of universal care at point of use and equity that have underpinned the NHS since its inception. Instead, increasingly, it's being made to embrace a market-driven approach that prioritises profit over people. Profits that will go into the deep pockets of exorbitantly wealthy shareholders instead of being sunk back into the service, which was the purpose of the NHS. This is the result of political choices that have been made by successive governments, not just this one, Conservative and Labour alike, but there's no difference between the two anymore. It's a political monopoly that runs this country these days, as Streeting gleefully made quite clear to us. The NHS is one of the most cherished institutions in the UK, and its future should not be determined by the interests of private donors or upon the whims of politicians that they've bought and paid for. Instead, it should be guided by the principles of fairness, equity and solidarity that it was set up under, that Labour once believed in to create it, yet are now competing with the Tories over who can destroy it and other services we all rely on the fastest. From healthcare to welfare to the elderly to the disabled, Starmer's Labour target all. And now it's emerged even our kids must pay too to cover the costs of what he'd prefer to spend public money on, as drastic school cuts are coming, leaving over 90% of secondary schools and more than 3/4 of primary schools unable to cover their full budgets. Get all the details of that threat to the next generation in this video recommendation. Here is your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as supporting the channel, which has now passed the 99,000 subscriber mark. So please do consider subscribing and be one of those to get the channel over the magic 100,000 subscriber line. And I will hopefully catch you on the next video. Cheers, folks.